All right. Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is having a educational experience here at the Roland B Scott Symposium. And welcome to our panel. Our panel discussion today is to be or not to be stigmatized. Is that really the question? I am Dr. Kendall Moody, assistant professor here. Well, not here, but assistant professor at the School of Social Work at Howard University. And I hope this discussion is a discussion. I know we're a panel, but I really hope that you all utilize the chat feature. If you have specific questions or curiosities, please use the chat feature. I will now take this time I will have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into our discussion for this afternoon. And I'll start with Ms. Cassandra Trimnell. You want to just give a little bit about yourself and then your connection to sickle cell.
Sure. My name is Cassandra Trimnell. I am an adult living with sickle cell disease. I live with type SS. I am also a wife and a mother of a 6-year-old. And I'm a certified sickle cell educator through our California Department of Public Health. I also am executive director at Sickle Cell 101, which is a nonprofit organization that specializes in sickle cell education. We do it primarily through social media, and our focus is really just to get important information out to patients and other stakeholders. So thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. All right, and next, Dr. Shawn Bediako.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Shawn Bediako, and I am most recently full professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where I'm on a leave of absence and currently serving as the director of the Office of Education for the Division of Intramural Research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. I've conducted research on the clinical implications of sickle cell stigma for about 2 decades now, and have been highly engaged in advocacy efforts, working with community-based grassroots organizations to advocate and try to improve the quality of life and to establish meaningful and equitable social policies for people living with sickle cell. Thank you for having me today. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Bediako. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Amar Zaidi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amar Zaidi. I often go by Dr. Z, if there's any warriors out there who may know me as Dr. Z. I'm a pediatric hematologist at the Children's Hospital of Michigan in Detroit, where we take care of about 800 patients with sickle cell disease. Though I am a sickle cell physician, my heart and my passion lies in sickle cell advocacy. So I use my 9 to 5 to pay the bills, but my 5 to 9 is just advocacy for sickle cell disease, and it's nonstop. So my passion has become medical misinformation, how information travels between physicians and patients, how patients receive information, and how to repair the bridge of trust between physicians and sickle cell warriors. And that's kind of what I've been pouring myself into over the last several years.
Thank you, Dr. Zaidi. Definitely very important work from the panel here. So you can see we have a very knowledgeable, competent panel here. And let's jump right into the discussion this afternoon. I want to start with Ms. Trimnell. If you could talk to us a little bit about your experience with sickle cell disease, both the positive and the challenging experiences leading to the experiences where you felt as though you were stigmatized.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Day-to-day looks different for me in terms of sickle cell, but I think some of the symptoms I deal with the most are fatigue, and I'm just now realizing that I am one of those chronic pain candidates, after years and years of denial. Luckily I do not have too many acute instances where I need to go to the ER, but when I do, it is always a challenging experience because of stigmas. Something that I've personally experienced includes, drug seeking or being asked if I was a drug seek, looking for pain medication. I also have a little sister who goes through the same things as well, where she, we go in looking for, pain relief and are turned away because our pain isn't believed. So that's I guess predominantly the stigma that I deal with, is that, we are looking for pain medication when we're seeking pain relief.
Yeah, and that actually speaks to my next question, and this is open to the panel, but I'll direct it at Dr. Zaidi here. Being as though you are a physician, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of patients are trained in learning, especially at a young age, the dose that works for them as far as their pain management. And as they go to the ER and they explain to the physicians or medical staff about their pain and what works for them, can you talk a little bit about the discrepancy there as patients are expected to know this information and they're educated on it, but also when they tell the doctors and nurses and medical staff about what works for them, they're looked at and perceived and stigmatized against in the medical world. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let's be very clear. The medical system has failed sickle cell patients. And really that stems from the fact that this healthcare system is not built to care for brown and Black communities. The medical history that we all know is clear as daylight that brown and Black patients are not the same, right? And are not treated the same, never have been treated worse. And yes, it's 2021, but as my friend Payal Desai said in one of her recent editorials, Jim Crow separate but equals exists in healthcare, right? That we have this happening in healthcare, and we talk to sickle cell patients about knowing as much as possible about their disease, being prepared when they sort of interact in the emergency room, and we know well that emergency room physicians sort of are turned off by that, right? I think that discrepancy though comes from the fact that most ER physicians probably don't individuate patients, right? They're looking at a brown or Black body in front of them, right? And they're pulling from just their common group stereotype that they already have about that brown and Black person in front of them. I can tell you for a fact, in medical school, we study sickle cell disease for maybe, I don't know, a day, a couple hours. Everything I've learned about sickle cell disease, I've learned from patients, right? I've learned with my interactions with people like Cass and other sickle cell warriors who tell me this is what sickle cell disease feels like, right? That's where you learn about sickle cell disease, and that's how you get to individuate patients. The fact that the ER never really gets to individuate patients and really see them as distinct people who are, who are often doing things way beyond just their diagnosis, right? I mean, most warriors that we have a fully functional life similar to us, right? They're living day to day. But ER physicians sometimes don't see that. And I think that bringing a little bit more awareness in that realm, where we can help our ER colleagues sort of get to that point where they're able to look beyond just that common group stereotype and sort of focus on the individual in front of them in that moment might help with that discrepancy.
Yeah, I definitely can agree with that and conceptualize that process. Now, I want to give Dr. Bediako, if you had a comment that you wanted to add to that, but also had a question for you after that comment, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think what Amar is saying is very important, and I think it's really critical for us to think about the historical context and the social and political context in which the care of people living with sickle cell disease occurs. And most of us are unaware of that historical context. We don't think about the historical continuity that ties generations of care in sickle cell. One epiphany that I've recently had in terms of my own level of growth, again, after 2 decades of doing this work, is to also just to take his observation a step further, is that there is this notion of what Melissa Creary calls biological citizenship as well. And if we were to go to Bahrain, for example, and talk about the experience of living with sickle cell in a ostensibly ethnically homogeneous environment, we'll see that people with sickle cell are also treated as second-class citizens. If we were to go to Turkey, if we were to go to Greece, if we would go to India or Pakistan, we would see the same sorts of experiences that, ironically, tie together this global experience of sickle cell as being a denigrated, devalued condition that does not seem to get the same sort of attention or care or access to the same resources, no matter where in the world you are. And it's one of the few conditions where we can say that about a condition, that no matter where you are in the world, there are not enough beds for people when they have sickle cell crisis, no matter where you are. In Nigeria, in Nairobi, or in North Philadelphia. It's the same story. And that's the irony about the global connection there.
Yeah, and just to continue on with what you were saying, and talking about or thinking of my experience working with patients with sickle cell, I'm trained as a social worker, as a medical social worker, and working in a clinic that my patients shared with oncology patients or hematology patients. You can see the discrepancy and the differences in the way children are treated when they present with some of the same symptoms, pain. It's definitely a discrepancy there. But I want to stay here, and I want to ask you, Dr. Bediako, if you can talk about sort of the long-term, short-term and long-term consequences or implications for being stigmatized. Like, what are some of the psychological, emotional, behavioral concerns, long-term and short-term?
Right. Thank you for that question. So, obviously, I think first there are multidimensional aspects of stigma. And one of the key things is that, again, as I've done this research, I have learned more and I have grown more and expanded my own thinking about it. That even when we use the term stigma, we're not talking about one thing that is a common experience for everyone. We're talking about things that are multidimensional, but we're also talking about an experience that's highly personalized and individualized, depending on the context, the resources that people have access to, depending on their own psychological, experiences. So, obviously, I think these multidimensional aspects of stigma really suggest that there are different types of psychological reactions that people can have in both the long and the short term. So if you think about the heightened vigilance that comes about because people are afraid that folks are always going to be treating them negatively, so that you have this hypervigilance, all the time, like just kind of waiting for the shoe to drop. That's not, that has some psychological implications. When you think about the internalized stigma, right? This notion of a diminished self-concept, lack of trust, inhibited relationships, an impaired sense of belonging, feeling misunderstood, a lack of confidence in a person's own autonomy, a loss of a sense of control. All of these can inhibit the pursuit of a full life. And I think those are some of the things that I would highlight just as a social psychologist. Those are the things that I would highlight as being some of the short and long-term psychological implications of stigma.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. So, again, I want to stay here. Cassandra, if you or Dr. Zaidi want to speak to that. Cassandra, you living with sickle cell. So I'm sure you can resonate with some of the words of Dr. Bediako as far as the feeling that's associated with being stigmatized. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think, it's something that starts from childhood. As soon as you tell a classmate you have sickle cell disease, people think it's contagious. They don't want to touch you or be near you. People walk on eggshells around you. And so that's something that I've definitely had to deal with. And it's one of those side effects that isn't really mentioned, but still very, very impactful. So that's what it was like growing up with sickle cell. In my adulthood, that stigma was there when, I worked retail for 7 years and didn't disclose that I had sickle cell disease. And I was fine in that job. And then when I finally did disclose because I got sick, I was let go, a week later. And that was clearly only because I disclosed my genotype. So there is still a lot of work ahead. I know in the work that we're doing with Sickle Cell 101, we have people outside of the US, as Dr. Bediako mentioned, people within Nigeria, and I'm Nigeria, there is that cultural context where it's so much of a stigma that if you have yellow eyes, for example, you have jaundice, you may not get hired for a job. Or I've had somebody send us an email in describing how a school couldn't admit her child because they didn't have a nurse, or other parents who did not want their children to play with that particular person. So it's definitely something that we carry with us, and it's all throughout life, manifests in different ways. It's a spectrum, even within family members. Family members saying, I don't have sickle cell trait, or, denying that they even have sickle cell trait. It's a huge, huge issue for some reason that definitely needs to be further looked into, and yeah.
Definitely, absolutely. Dr. Zaidi, did you have a comment there? Or I know that you've been vocal about the psychosocial aspects of sickle cell disease in general, but also the stigma that comes along with it. So I was hoping that you could speak to on the medical side, the psychosocial, what we need more of in the psychosocial world as it relates to sickle cell disease.
Sure. Obviously, sickle cell disease is really at its core biologically pretty simple, right? It's one change in one protein that happens to every single warrior in the same way. But what we know of sickle cell disease is nothing about sickle cell disease from warrior to warrior is uniform.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's story with sickle cell disease looks a little bit different, right? The way that the psychosocial aspect plays into this is so critical at every level. I mean, no matter how you break that down, the first thing is the most common symptom of sickle cell disease is pain. And the biggest lie ever told is that sickle cell disease is a disease of pain, right? Because while pain is important, whether or not you're having pain, sickle cell disease patients are dying earlier than others, right? Even if they're not having pain. So the way to think about sickle cell disease is as a disease of disparities, right? And those disparities, it's a disease of early death, really. And those disparities play out in every realm, biologically, psychosocially. From a psychosocial standpoint, I can tell you that there's clear evidence that stress, mental well-being, mental illness, which already is another stigma in our country that we face. These are things that are very, very much related to how patients feel physically, right? How they do, how often they're in the hospital. Things like food insecurity and absenteeism and not being able to have jobs, they all play into the mental well-being of the sickle cell patient. Just from a social standpoint, the sort of structural racism that exists against people of color is amplified in the sickle cell population. And that plays out in every single realm. So I can give you the example here. We're talking about stigma for patients, right? But I always say that sickle cell disease is the back of the bus disease, right? This is very true for patients. But me as a sickle cell physician, I'm also a victim of that structural racism cage, because when I go to my hospital and ask for more resources, well, I'm just the sickle cell doctor, right? So that cage of structural racism is suppressing all of us, right? Anyone who's touching sickle cell disease is a victim of that type of oppression that's being put down from the top. So this plays out in every single realm of healthcare.
Yeah, a very interesting point. And we work primarily with children, is that right, Dr. Zaidi? Yeah,
that's right.
I was hoping that, and anyone can answer this. What are your thoughts about the stigma that's associated with adults in relation to sickle cell disease? as a lot of times the adults don't have the support coming into the emergency room as children do. They have parents there who may or may not be able to advocate for them while they come in. I use the emergency room because that's a haven for stigma. But I was hoping that Dr. Bediako and the panel could talk about adults. What are some of the things they experience as far as stigma?
So, I mean, I don't know how much time we have on the panel to kind of talk about all the things, because I will, just share that my academic interest in stigma came about because of an interaction that I had with an adult in a sickle cell clinic before. Before then, I was kind of what Dr. Z was talking about. My focus was on pain and trying to understand how better to develop psychological interventions to deal with pain. But while I was in the clinic one day, I was talking to an older guy, and I was, I had what I thought was a brilliant idea, which was, hey, we got all these older guys who have been living with sickle cell. I'm like, I should get a group together and they could come like mentor and talk to these younger guys. And when I asked the older men who, who would be interested in doing that, all of them said, no, absolutely not. And I'm sitting here like, that doesn't make sense. Like, what do you mean? Like, and I'm,
Right.
In my own academic arrogance, I'm sitting here thinking like, why would you not do this? Here's an opportunity to talk to the next generation and all these things. And it wasn't until a guy pulled me to the side. He was like, let's walk to the cafeteria. Let me talk to you for a second. And we go down to the cafeteria, go drink some juice. And he hips me to the game. And he tells me, he's like, look, man, when we were kids and we were growing up, folks told us we would die before we were 20. And we lived our life that way. These kids coming behind us, they got a much better prognosis for what life is going to look like for them, but we don't have anything to tell them because we didn't make the right decisions. I'm like, but don't you think that story is important to share? Again, being an academic, that academic arrogance, I'm thinking, well, you should share that story. You should. And he was like, no, I don't want to share that story. They're going to be all right. I don't want to talk about the mistakes I made because it was stigmatizing. And so I learned from that lesson that, as researchers, we often craft a narrative about the sickle cell experience that is consistent with how we as scientists hypothesize things should lay out. But what we don't do enough of is actually listen to the stories and the experiences of the people who we say that we are, in service to. And that was one of the main thing. When I started talking to him more, I realized that I had a bunch of assumptions that I was making about the experience of living with sickle cell, like things that I thought were always negative. I learned that sometimes people turn those things into a positive, and that it's always not such a linear relationship between variables, and that there's always not a neat conceptual framework or model that everything just neatly falls into, that there's a lot of nuance, a lot of complexities, and that if I was to be any type of researcher worth my salt, one of the things I needed to do was to listen more than and then kind of take my skill set as a researcher to try to, put a program of research in place that was going to have an impact on people's lives. So, that's a long-winded way of kind of answering your question. That for me, when I think about this experience with adults, I think that people have the autonomy and have had the agency to be able to kind of turn things in ways that work for them. And I think as researchers, that's what we need to give more credence to, kind of listening to, and not try to, just automatically using these pre-existing theories and frameworks to try to fit people's experiences in ways that make sense to us as researchers.
Absolutely. Did anyone else on the panel have anything to add to that, or any thoughts on that? No. I do have a question from Dr. Rana, who's in the audience and attendee today, and he asked, how much difference can we make by educating healthcare workers about stigma and its impact on people? So how much of a difference do you think we can make through the education to healthcare workers?
So I'll jump on that one real quick before my co-panelists chime in. You know, one of the things that changed the way that I have approached my career is that in 2000, many of you probably heard this story. In 2014, I took something called an implicit association test, and I took it really arrogantly. Right, I'm Pakistani. My father worked for an anti-racism secretariat for the government of Canada. So I took this thinking, this is gonna just tell me that I don't have a bias, right? And that's because that's how I've been raised. And you know, I don't have a bias. So very arrogantly I take this, and the test comes back and it says, you have a slight preferential bias to white people. And at first I was sort of blown away by this. A few weeks later I take it again and the same result comes through. And that was an inflection point in my career, because I took a minute and I was like, well, wait a minute. What if this is real? This is real. This is a problem, because I treat 800 sickle cell patients in Detroit, right? There's too much of a power dynamic here for me to not be able to recognize that I have an implicit bias, right? That may be factoring into this. And all this has done for me is that as I've gone forward, I just keep looking in my blind spot, whereas I wouldn't have been before, right? So now every time I think about making a medical decision, it's always, hey, wait a minute, let me think about this one more time. Let me check to make sure that I'm not going to bump into something here. Let me make sure I'm making the right choice, right? So now everything goes through that lens. It goes through that second kind of reflex type of thought process. It goes through like a secondary check. And that has really made me a better physician, I believe, for my patients, just to be able to say, you know what, I have a bias. Right? For me to say that has made me better. I think that part of the problem is we are so bias phobic, where people just don't want to acknowledge it, right? We're colorblind. We're not, we don't see color, this narrative, right? We're scientists, we're physicians, like we treat everybody the same. Well, we're not here to treat everybody the same, right? Because equity doesn't mean you treat everybody the same. It means you give people who need an extra push. Now, the reason for this whole story is, going back to Dr. Rana's question, is educating people and just making them aware about sickle cell disease enough? I mean, maybe, but I actually think we need to challenge people more and let them sort of really dive into their own biases that may exist, that may be holding them back, that may be unconscious, that may be implicit, that are keeping them from making appropriate decisions. Those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I was in the hospital setting working as a sickle cell social worker, I can remember going down to the emergency room meeting with our patients. And one of the things that I strive to do was build a relationship with all 500 of the patients that we served in the Hampton Roads area. And I remember I was working with this young man, a teenager, struggled with chronic pain. And he comes in, and he to his credit, he tried everything as far as acupuncture, different medical or different pain medicines, tried it all. And he came into the emergency room, and by that time, the staff knew who he was. And I remember walking out of his room after talking with him, and medical staff comes up to me and says, "All right, so what are we going to do?" And we explain, our treatment process. And she says, "Oh man, just treat this." She said something to the effect of just treating the future drug seekers of America, or something to that effect. And we stopped and looked at her, and it caught me off guard. And I was like, okay, I had to process it, because I knew at that moment I had to do something. I mean, it didn't sit well with me. So I go up and talk to one of the physicians, Dr. Owen at that time, Dr. Owen, who's still there. And we found this article on implicit and explicit bias and ways to identify it. And I printed off that article, ran down to the emergency room, and spoke with her about it and handed it to her. I don't have a follow-up to that. I would love to know what was her reaction to that, but it speaks to the when you have a preconceived notion about a particular person or a group of people, and you meet somebody from that group, you do have a bias that I think we all need to recognize. And so, to speak to Dr. Rana's question, that is important, that we educate and we combat stigma, racism, because these are all the different ways you can be stigmatized. It's racism, implicit, explicit bias. These are all different avenues. So yeah, that's my story as it relates to the education. But to get back on what we were talking about, communication was something that came up as far as being able to communicate to patients with sickle cell and medical staff. So uh, Cassandra, if you could speak to how did it feel communicating your pain or your worry or your just however you were feeling to medical staff? What was that like for you?
It's different for every experience, but I guess for the most part, it is difficult. When you are coming into the ED, and this is one of my experiences, you're waiting in, just the ED hour after hour, you're in this extreme amount of pain. And, you're checking in with triage and asking what's an update, when can I get seen? You finally get a healthcare provider and they ask you, first question right off the bat, how long have you had sickle cell for? Or how long have you been a sickler for? Using that words, just to what you're saying, words matter. And you find a lot of the times, and Dr. Zaidi said it so beautifully, stigmas can come from both the good guys and the bad guys. So I think, when we think of stigma, we think, oh, this is those people, right? But it really is something that we need to look inward and something. I've had doctors say, it's just a harmless word, using the word sickler, or healthcare, nurses, for example, say, oh, you're so nice for a sickle cell patient, thinking it's a compliment, but, that's like a backhanded compliment. And so it is, when you're trying to get care, you want to be on your best behavior, but at the same time, you're dealing with, a lot of this type of language. You're dealing with people who just don't know or don't care. So it is a uphill battle when we're in that clinical and ED settings.
Yeah, yeah. That word sickler, oh man, it just resonates with me. And oh man, so I see Dr. Zeta, you're shaking your head. Is that something that you hear a lot in the medical world?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up way more than it should, right? And
Yeah.
it's disappointing, right, that we're in 2021 and this is something that we're still trying to address. This goes back to that concept of individuating patients, right? Like patients
Yeah.
are not their diagnosis, right?
Right.
Cassandra is Cassandra, right? And she's a human being who's doing all this cool stuff and happens to have sickle cell disease.
Yeah.
So making her identity primarily that is just so damaging in every way.
Yeah.
But it comes up a lot.
Yeah, that's so true. And that actually leads into my next question for the panel is a lot of times you hear all the, I won't say negative, but the challenging aspect of sickle cell. But I'll tell you, I've worked with patients for many years and I see a lot of the positive. I see the resilience. I see all that information. So the question to the panel, what do you think goes into patients feeling, and Cassandra, you can speak to this as well, the resilience factor? What do you think contributes to the resilience factor? I know this isn't directly related to stigma, but I have a point here. But I just want to hear your thoughts about that.
Is this one for me?
Yeah, sure. You can start.
Okay. So in terms of resilience, I mean, being strong is our only choice, right? And being able to navigate this, it doesn't mean we should have to. The burden we're already carrying is already so heavy. I guess that's why they call us sickle cell warriors, because we're battling on many fronts. It's not it's multifaceted, and it's something that it really does take every aspect of your life to to deal with. And yeah, I think I don't know if this answers your question, but I almost feel like resiliency is built in with the sickle cell gene. You kind of have to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That absolutely answers my question. I think about the many patients who, despite the pain, despite the fatigue, they get up and they go to school, and they still try to engage in the activities to a point where they know their body. So I think that speaks to my question here. There's a few questions that came through the chat that I want to talk about and bring up. Dr. Zaidi, there's a question for you. What enhanced you in becoming such a strong advocate for sickle cell disease? And then the next question is, do you advocate at all levels, or is it mostly the local level?
So I'll answer the second question first. I'll advocate to like a tree if I need to, right? So any time of the day, any place, wherever I can, whoever will listen to me, even sometimes when they don't listen to me, I'll advocate for sickle cell disease. So it's at every level. There's a few things, I think. The first is that, sickle cell disease, by the time this panel is done, there will be 30 new warriors in the world, right? There's a child with sickle cell disease born every 2 minutes worldwide, and one every hour in this country. The stakes are too high. There's no other disease that's going through this. There's no other disease that's going through this in this quantity. We're so far behind from where we need to be that to me, it became clear in my training, and my training was hematology and oncology. It becomes clear that even though from a quality of life standpoint, you could make an argument that sickle cell disease quality of life, just from a physical standpoint, is worse than somebody who has cancer and is getting chemotherapy, right? But the way that patients are treated, the differential treatment became so apparent to me during my fellowship that I decided that this is what I want to dive into. Like, this is where I want to make a difference in this exact space. And that sort of, the more you look for it, the more you find it. It's one of those things as you just you can keep peeling back that onion, and then there's just layer after layer of disparity and stigma and racism and prejudice and bias, and it just kind of keeps growing. So I would say that every interaction I have with the sickle cell community has further empowered me to want to do this with more passion. I don't know if that answers the question well, but that's the best shot I can give you right now.
Well, yeah, I think that's insightful, and I actually want to pose this to Dr. Bediako. What propelled you to become such a strong advocate in your research and your work with sickle cell patients?
Well, first, I don't know that it was ever intentional. I think I've been blessed and fortunate to be in the right place at the right time. I was mentored at the beginning of my research career by Karen Gill at North Carolina. And at that time, she was probably one of the few people who was in health psychology, who actually studied sickle cell with pediatric, adolescent, and adult populations. And so she was the one who really opened my eyes to the possibilities of making a career in the academy doing sickle cell research. And she was very supportive with respect to my ideas about culture and about race and how those things all come together. Because, she was the one who told me very early on that, I could make some significant contributions if I stayed in this, in this arena. So, and again, I've just been very fortunate to have been around some excellent, outstanding people at the University of Cincinnati, also at Johns Hopkins. I've just been around a great group of people who have valued the voice that I bring to the collaborative work that we engaged in. And so, that is very affirming in and of itself. So that was kind of my, and once I got into it, again, it just, first, I'm a nerd. So I'll put that out there first. I love science and I love research. So it's not just something that I do, it's really who I am. And had that level of conscientiousness about myself that was really ingrained from my family, from my community, that anything that I engaged in, I needed to make sure that it was about more than just me as an individual. And so if I had a skill set, then I need to make sure that that skill set is put in service to other people. And, what better space and place to do that in than in the area of sickle cell. And as I've mentioned, I have learned as much or more from folks who are living with sickle cell, who are directly impacted by sickle cell. And I'm just hoping that what I can give back as a researcher is, at some level helpful and meaningful to other folks as well. But I've gained and benefited a lot from just being able to talk to people who have been willing to share their experiences with me. And, when I go back to the lab and I try to figure out, well, okay, these are some things that we could do to try to make a difference in people's lives. That's been the best job to have in the world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And in my similar to your story, I sort of fell into the role as a medical social worker for patients with sickle cell disease, and I loved it. And I had the opportunity to change and switch and work with patients with diagnosed with cancer. And with all due respect to that population, I chose to stick with patients with sickle cell disease. I felt as though I wasn't not helping them, but they were also helping me become a better clinician for them. And I thought that was really powerful. But there's another question here, and we'll start to wrap up here. And I'll pose this question for the panel. Where do we go from here? And we talk about stigma and the ways in which it affects the sickle cell population. Where do we go? Is it through education? Is it through advocacy? Like, what avenues? How do we make this better?
I think it's through all of the above. As I mentioned, earlier on, there's no one way of looking at stigma. So therefore, there's not going to be any one particular way to overcome it. And I think it's going to require a lot of alignment in resources, in education. So there are three main things that I think are important. One is that, we need a lot of affirmation. And what I mean by that is that people who are directly affected by sickle cell, in order to overcome stigma, it really requires you to get inside yourself and know who you are, so that you can build up some immunity to all those things that happen out, in the world. The way that other people see you is not the only way that you are forced to see yourself. And so there's a lot of building up in terms of your self-concept, your identity, things to affirm your own self-worth that I think are important. And then the second thing had to do with education, as you just mentioned, but on both sides of the equation. I think people who are living with sickle cell need to understand the physiological aspect, like what's going on in your body objectively, but also be able to articulate what's going on in your body subjectively, how you feel. And being that level of education is important, because that gives us that third aspect, which is communication, that has already come up as well. Because once you know what makes you tick and what brings you relief, or what brings you a comfort and peace, then you're able to communicate that to other people, and you'll be better able to enlist them as co-conspirators, if you will, in your pursuit of wellness. So I think that those three things are important. We need to do more in terms of interventions and services to help affirm people's identities and self-concepts. We need to do more to educate people about their condition, but we also need to educate the public about the condition. And then we need to create these channels where there can be an even flow of two-way communication, so that we can then figure out what are we going to do going forward.
All right, that's an excellent point. And for the last 6 minutes, I have a few questions. This will be our speed answer session. So let's do that. And that sort of speaks to Doris, who's the fellow social worker of mine. I see she asked the question, how can the public / clinicians help raise awareness? She learned a lot today from the symposium that she was not aware of. So that sort of speaks to this question. But if Dr. Zaidi or Ms. Trimnell, if you had any thoughts about how the public can raise awareness about this?
I'm gonna let Cass answer that because literally her mission is that.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Zaidi. Yeah, the way I couldn't, agree more with what Dr. Bediako said. Education is key. What people are in the comments are saying, education is key. And of course, I'm biased as an educator. And so the way I see it with healthcare providers, there's two buckets of people, and there are those who don't know and those who don't care. So for those who don't know, we educate them. We start early, as early as possible. I know some of the work we do with Sickle Cell 101, our medical director and I, and a caregiver, we give presentations because we want to provide the whole story. It's nice to, just provide a patient perspective or a healthcare perspective, but if you combine all three of them, you really do get the whole story and a better representation of the experience. For those who know better but just don't care, that's where policy comes in, and where we need to make sure that we are protecting patients through policy and giving, slaps on the wrist, or, whatever is needed to make sure that patients are being treated the way that we should be treated. So, and then going out and banging the drum about it, general awareness, it really just helps everything. If there's more people who know about sickle cell, there's more interest, there's more money, there's more everything. I think we, on our platform, put out a graphic yesterday that compared, sickle cell disease with cystic fibrosis, and just the differences between the two. Sickle cell was discovered first, and has less drug therapies. There's less federal funding per person. So really just making this known, making a big deal, or I shouldn't say a big deal, but really raising awareness about the disparities and policy. I really think it worked to the point where, things just really, the way this country's set up and everything, it's kind of, it really is an uphill battle. So we really do need policy in order to get things done.
Right. And I hope that policy, as far as the Make-A-Wish, I hope that policy changes. I think that's what you're referencing as far as cystic fibrosis. Now they can just, that you put down cystic fibrosis on the application for Make-A-Wish and it's automatic. Whereas you put down sickle cell disease, they want to know, well, how is it impacting them? No, it shouldn't be that way. And that actually speaks to the stigma and racism that we were talking about today. Absolutely. Cassandra, I have one more, and hopefully we can get this question in before we're kicked out of here. There's a question in the audience that asks, what advice would you give to parents and physicians taking care of children and adolescents with sickle cell disease so that they can become resilient adults? Very good question.
Oh, wow, that is a wonderful question. Advice. Sickle cell is not a death sentence. I know it's tough, but this is something that, with proper just being followed with, healthcare providers, being as involved as possible in education and advocacy. I was saying in a presentation yesterday, advocacy really is a cornerstone to disease management. And it really has been very helpful for me personally in navigating the disease. Through advocacy, you meet others like you. Sickle cell is a very isolating disorder. So you meet all the right people, you learn so much how to navigate this. You learn about policy, you learn about, healthcare, you learn about all of, all the factors that go into what makes sickle cell today. And so just making sure you stay informed as possible and educated is I think that's the key to resilience. Just the more knowledge is power, I guess, to button it up. Knowledge is power. And when you have that knowledge, you have the tools in order to better navigate this complex situation, which is, in this country and globally. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but to me, it really has been education and advocacy is the backbone of resilience.
Yes, that does answer our question. And it actually takes us to the end of our panel. So thank you, Dr. Bediako, Dr. Zaidi, Ms. Trimnell, for your expertise, your knowledge. I believe, I'm looking at the chat here, everyone was informed. If they weren't informed, and they enjoyed the panel discussion. So outstanding job to everyone on the panel. So I want to introduce the next session. Hopefully you will enjoy it. Doing it well. Sex, family planning, and sickle cell. I hope you all enjoy that. Thank you for joining our panel, and I hope you have a good rest of your symposium.